Hi! Welcome to another art lesson by yours truly. Man, do I have quite the lesson for you today. In today's lesson, we are going to be talking about graphic design, what really makes an eye-catching poster. Afterwards, we use our knowledge and screen print our own unique poster to advertise a part of our everyday lives. To begin, what even is the purpose of a poster? Well, most posters have three goals: to catch your attention, inform you, and lastly, to get you to act. Today we're going to be making our own posters, and if we want to make sure we hit these three goals, we are going to want to first identify two things: the what and the who. What is what are we advertising? An event? Real estate? A product? Well, for today's lesson, I am challenging you to find something in your everyday life and turn it into one of these goals. For example, for my poster today, I am taking the concept of my cat and his devilish antics and turning it into a movie poster that I would want people to see. Some other ideas could be, if you're a musician, maybe you would want to advertise a concert by you. If you're the outdoorsy type, sell real estate on your favorite hiking trail. The options are only restrained by your creativity. Once we have identified our what, we need to identify our who, which is our audience. This is important to consider because if we're selling life insurance to an 80-year-old versus a toy to a 5-year-old, the layout and way we communicate within our poster is going to be completely different. So with the goal of our poster decided upon, we now need to consider how our poster will be laid out. There are 5 elements we need to pay attention to when creating our poster, which are scale, the hierarchy of information, contrast, space, and lastly, balance and alignment. So let's begin with scale. One of the biggest things you need to make sure with your poster is that it is readable from a distance. And by that, I mean that no matter how big or small you make your poster, within reason of course, the viewer can clearly see the basic components of the poster. The basic components we need to consider when deciding scale are that of the headline, details, and the fine print. We get more into these components in the next element, the hierarchy of information. What I mean by the hierarchy of information is basically you deciding what is most important for your audience to see first, and then how you convey that importance through your poster. The order of importance should be as follows: the headline, the call to action, and then the fine print. For example, in this poster here, we can clearly see the headline first and foremost. It is emphasized through not only scale, as we discussed, but also by color and font. The headline is the first thing your audience reads when looking at your poster and needs to be relatively short and memorable. Next, we have the call to action and the fine print. The call to action is basically what you want from your audience. So if you have an event, it is telling you why you should go. And if it's real estate, it's telling you why you should buy that property. And in our example here, it is clarifying the headline. Basically, all call to actions are telling you why the headline is interesting and important. The call to action here is put directly under the headline, but is in smaller font and in a color that does not take away from the overall design. Lastly is the fine print. This is where the essential information is placed, the where, when, or how of the poster. The example we have here is right below the call to action, and after it has grabbed your attention with the headline and given you directions with the call to action, the fine print informs you on how to follow through with the call to action. In this example, the goal is simply to inform, so we just have more information on the subject of the poster. In another example, if you're hosting an event, this is where you'd place essential information like ticket prices or general directions to the event location. Remember when designing your layout to not place all information at the same level of contrast, as essential information will then become jumbled. Make it easy for the viewer to follow along and not have to question what to read first. Next is contrast. Now, this is pretty self-explanatory as we discussed this in Art 1, but basically this is what makes your poster pop. I cannot stress enough how important it is to make your poster stand out and really grab your audience's attention. The easiest way to do this while also assisting in readability is by contrasting your basic elements of art. There are a variety of ways to create contrast, and here I've included just a few examples, such as color, texture, pattern, and scale. This Disney poster here is a great example of how simple contrast can be dark. A textured background really makes the solid green of the dinosaur stand out. Also note the great use of negative space to add great drama to the image. Now we have space. While we all have a pretty good concept of space as an element of art, there are some rules we need to consider when making our own poster. Given that once again, we really want our poster to be as clear and readable as possible, we're actually going to be using more space than usual between different parts of our poster. Some places we would want to consider using greater space are listed here, which are between letters, in the margins, in your headlines especially, or just between different elements that compose your entire work. I chose these two figures here because even though they approach space differently, they both find ways to increase space and bring the eye to essential information. Notice the space used in the margins of the top poster, or the space between the headline letters and the contrasting background on the bottom poster. The last component of poster layout we're going to be discussing today is balance and alignment. So the reason these two are grouped together is that in graphic design, your balance really stems from the alignment of certain components. As you can see, you have 4 different types of alignment, which I'm sure you are familiar with if you've used any sort of Google Docs or Word software. We have right alignment, where content is on the right side of the page, and justified alignment, where content is between 2 set margins. Justified is also the easiest for people to read, as there is extra spacing between letters and words. Next, there is center alignment, which is pretty self-explanatory. Content is down the center. And lastly, left alignment, where content is on the left side of the page. So when considering balance, center and justified tend to be the most stable and well-balanced. The left and right alignment can also add some dynamism to your final design. Consider balancing out whatever alignment you choose with other components. So if text is mostly right aligned, maybe have the background be a contrasting color, or add some graphics to the left side to bring some balance. Now that we know what to consider when it comes to the layout, let's start making some art! This project is a doozy and will need quite a few materials. I will let you know what materials you will need as we use them, but the full list is here and is as follows: sketch and printing paper, pencils, India ink, paintbrushes, Mylar sheets, a silkscreen, mine is 8 by 10 inches with 110 mesh, a hinge board to secure and register your silkscreen, photo emulsion, screen printing ink, a squeegee, a rubber spatula or popsicle sticks for mixing ink, foam core board, masking or painter's tape, and lastly, a pane of glass. All of these materials will help us print our poster via the serigraph printing method, otherwise known as screen printing. This is a very popular printing process which produces prints by pressing ink through a silkscreen. This process originated in East Asia, namely China and Japan, where it was used mostly on textiles and fabrics. I'm sure many of you have seen this process done with t-shirts, and most likely have a screen printed t-shirt yourself. Let's start out with some thumbnail sketches. Take a sheet of paper and a pencil and try to utilize the components we learned about today to get several designs laid out. Try to try out several different layouts and alignments. You might be surprised with what works and what doesn't for your poster. Notice on my sketches here, I didn't include the actual text, and instead simply wrote words as a placeholder. This is to make sure the design is strong enough to be noticeable on its own without the aid of written words. Once you have decided on a layout, let's talk about one more thing before we include our actual text: typography. Typography is basically the style or appearance of our text. As you can see in this picture I've included here, where the word water is labeled in 2 different fonts, it actually reads quite differently in your head, just by some pretty simple changes. So when you take your chosen poster design and add your text, first make sure you use clear and concise language as to make sure information is relayed as accurately as possible. Next, determine the tone that you're going for, which you should already have a good idea of given you've completed the basic layout. Now, consider experimenting with different fonts, colors, or boldness to make sure your text fits well within your layout. You can never have enough sketches. I do recommend, however, limiting the amount of fonts used to 1 or 2. One for the headline and one for the call to action and the fine print. You don't want your poster to seem too confusing or busy. Now we should have a strong idea of our final design, so let's draw it to full size. Your design should be slightly smaller than the size of your silkscreen, so in my example, my poster will be 7 by 9 inches. Now it's time to talk color. In this project, we're going to do a 3 color run, which means we're going to actually print our poster 3 different times, each time adding a different color. That means we will actually have 4 colors to design our posters with, the 3 color inks we use, and white. For example, here's a full color sketch of my design. I personally use color pencil for this, so you can create your color study with whatever medium you find most comfortable. Once you have your color decided upon, you need to have a good understanding on how color will be layered. When screen printing, we start with the lightest color first, and then progressively add darker colors on top. This is to make sure the bright colors come through and allows us just to layer the dark colors. So first is white. When we push ink through our silkscreen, we will not want ink or color on these spots, so we will need to block those in immediately. Think of it like putting tape on a strainer. The places you block with tape will not have water come through. Just like in a silkscreen, the places you put emulsion on will not have ink come through. In this case, we're going to be using a light-sensitive emulsion to block the ink from coming through the screen. When exposed to UV light, the emulsion dries and cannot be washed out with water. That means when designing our color layers, we're actually going to be putting black ink on a clear transparency for the space we want ink to pass through, as it will stop light from hitting the emulsion, allowing us to wash it out and let ink pass through later. Once again, let's look at my design. The first color we're going to lay down is going to be orange, so we're first going to need to block in the places that we want to keep white. Here's a sketch of what my mylar should look like during my first run. The next color in our design is magenta, and I want to keep our white and orange areas we have in our design. So the next layer, both the white and the orange spots will be blocked in, so our second run will look like this. The last and darkest color in my design is black, so now I need to make sure I block in all of my white, orange, and magenta areas. My third and final run will look like this on my screen. If you have any questions considering this part of the process, skip to the timestamp here to get a better idea. Now that we have an idea on how our color will be layered, let's begin to transfer our image and develop our silkscreen. First, take the full-size image that we did earlier of our poster and lay a sheet of mylar transparency on top of it. Now, using our India ink and a paintbrush, we're simply going to fill in the first layer we sketched out earlier. Another option for you digital artists is to design everything on your computer and simply print out onto a transparency. You can also use a fountain pen in India ink for small details, though here I'm simply going to use a paintbrush. Here's an example of what my first run will be on my mylar. Now let's put that aside and move on to the next step, coating our screen in light-sensitive emulsion. Here I'm using Diazo Photo Emulsion. It comes with Photo Emulsion Remover, which we will not be using right now, Photo Emulsion, and Light Sensitizer. I am simply following the instructions included, filling the light sensitizer halfway with water and shaking it up until it is fully mixed. Next, I take the sensitizer and pour it into the photo emulsion, stirring until the color has changed from a pale blue to a nice olive green and everything appears fully mixed. Once the emulsion has had time to rest in a cool dark spot overnight, I am now going to take my silkscreen and pour some of the emulsion on the flat side of the screen. I probably poured too much initially here. Try to pour a little bit at a time. Now take your squeegee and, at about a 45-degree angle, simply glide across and evenly spread the emulsion on, covering the entire screen. As you can see, I am also squeegeeing the inside of the screen, getting any excess. Once the screen is evenly coated, I'm going to take my screen and store it in a cool dark place to dry for about 4 to 5 hours. Meanwhile, go ahead and make sure you clean and store all of your other materials. Once your screen is dry, it is time to develop. Cut a piece of foam core board so it will fit to size within your screen, taping to help keep secure. Next, tape your mylar ink side down onto the flat side of your screen with clear tape, then lay a pane of clear glass on top. The goal here is to have your transparency as flush to your screen as possible in order to have a clear development. Next, as you can see, I have placed the book under my foam core board and inside the screen, just to make sure it has an extra level of support to sandwich the screen and the mylar together. I then take this exact layout outside and then expose my screen to as direct sunlight as possible. On a sunny day, this wouldn't take any longer than about 30 seconds. Though where I am today, this is a heavy overcast, so I actually take closer to 6.5 minutes for my screen to develop before I cover it once again and carry it back inside. You should have a faint discoloration in the spots that were exposed to sunlight, now a darker blue compared to the green of the spots that were not exposed. Now it is time to rinse out the emulsion that wasn't exposed to sunlight. Using either a hose or a sink sprayer like I am here, first run water over and generally soak the screen for about a minute or two. Next, spray your screen in the areas that were not exposed. Notice how the emulsion is starting to run out and we're starting to see the original color of the screen. A sprayer with good pressure works best, although if you don't have one, simply put your thumb over the nozzle to help increase the pressure. Here's what my fully developed screen looks like finished, compared to both our sketch and our mylar transparency. If you have access to multiple silk screens, you can repeat this exact same process with creating the mylar and exposing for your other 2 layers. If not, stick around, and after we print our first run, I will show you another way to get your next 2 layers. The next step is to register your image. First, I'm screwing my image down to the hinge board, making sure it is secure and not moving. Next, decide your margins. My poster is 7 by 9 inches, so I have about a 1/2 inch margin around my paper. I am marking this dummy sheet here with dark markers and labeling the top, bottom, and side. Now, to better move around the paper, I'm taping these paper sticks to my sheet. Then, using the guidelines I made earlier, I'm lining up my dummy sheet to my screen, making sure to press gently on the screen so they line up properly. Once I have my image lined up, I'm gently lifting my screen to make sure my paper doesn't move, then taping around, not on the corners, with about 4 layers of tape to act as my registration corners. And here's my registered paper. Now to the most fun part, printing. First, mix your ink. I'm starting out with my light orange, so I'm taking a little bit of white and adding yellow, then red. Once my ink is mixed, I lay a strip of ink down on the screen and do what is known as a flood stroke, where I'm just getting the ink through the screen initially. Next, lay a sheet of paper you wish to print on into your registration corners you created earlier. And just like when coating the screen with emulsion, pull the ink across the screen with a squeegee at about a 45-degree angle. You are going to want to do a couple of passes, making sure to use firm pressure. Try with different amounts of ink at different pressures on separate sheets of paper. You'll start to be able to tell the ratio of ink and pressure you're going for. And voila! There is the first layer of our poster done. Although like many good printmakers, we're going to want to do several good copies, laying them out to dry. I ultimately decided to cover the thin border on my poster, which is why it doesn't come through in later copies. Once you're done printing, now time to clean your screen. You wouldn't want your ink drying in your screen. Simply scrape off and store all excess ink, and then take your screen to the sink, where you're going to spray it with your sink hose until all of the ink is starting to run through. It might help if you use a sponge to help rub away some of the ink. Once you have finished printing your first layer, there are 2 options. One, as I stated earlier, is repeating the same development process for your screen. You can do this either on multiple screens or rinse out the emulsion and reprint on the screen you have. To learn how to rinse out and clean your screen, skip to the timestamp here. The other option is to hand paint and fill in the spots on your screen. By this, I mean take your full-size drawing you did earlier and lay it under your screen. Next, using a paintbrush, fill in the spots you wish to protect on the previous layer. For example, here's what the layer would look like if I were developing on my mylar. I am painting the reverse of this on my screen. Basically, I am painting the places I would like to keep orange. And here's my coated screen. Now I'm going to simply re-register my screen and print just as we did last time, though on top of our first layer. And here's what my second layer looks like printed. Now time for the last and darkest layer, the black. Just the same process we've done, preparing my screen, then printing. Let's take a moment to assess each layer and how the screen was set up. How well did you follow your color layout? Lastly, let's clean our screen. First, wash out the ink like normal. Next, all we need to do is simply take our emulsion remover, and here I've put it in a spray bottle just to make it easier, and I'm going to spray my screen on both sides and let it soak for 2 to 3 minutes. Afterwards, I am once again using my sink hose and a sponge to wash out all the emulsion. If you have access to a pressure washer, use this instead. It'll probably work much better. And here's the finished poster. While it was a long process, it has produced some really cool and graphic results. How'd you design your poster? Thank you so much for working with me today. See you next time!